Hi, hello, I'm Sam Harris and I read, review and discuss fantasy and science fiction books. Today we have another episode of my Wandering Inn read-along where we will be discussing, with full spoilers, the contents of Chapter 46 of Volume 1 of The Wandering Inn. So this one was kind of we've had a few downer chapters in the past which have had been kind of sad. And this one was quite a mixture. So it kind of ends in a bit of a sad place, but I feel like we have some good news and we have some intriguing story points. The one thing that I've noticed with these chapters is that even though the chapters are getting longer, Pirate Arbor is spending more time on each kind of scene and conversation. So actually, I think these videos are starting to get shorter, even though the chapters are getting longer, if that makes sense. So at the end of the last week's chapter, which I actually read 2 weeks ago, so I did read back I just kind of skim read it to make sure I knew what was going on. So Erin was at Kershia's place, and she just told Kershia that she was from our world, from another universe, and Kershia collapses when Erin tells her how many people live on Earth. So we kind of come back just as Kershia is waking up from fainting, basically. And she's like, oh, yeah, that just was such a high number of people, I couldn't really conceptualize it, and passed out. Then she goes into, Erin goes into a few... she talks a little bit about how the world is different and technology and a few other things like that. Erin actually does what Ryoka refused to do, which is she explains how cars work, and she talks about guns and how they relate to crossbows and bows and things like that. So all in all, Erin doing some real maybe not smart stuff here. She explains a load of stuff, and then she tells her a little bit about how magic doesn't exist on Earth, and interestingly, so Kershia is like, this knowledge of your world is very valuable to me. If you can tell me more about your world, then I can maybe help you out with something that you want as a trade, or the Gnolls as a tribe can help her out. And this is where I started to get a bit more suspicious of Kershia. So I had already been a little bit she's acting kind of sus. But now I think that there's a conversation later in the chapter. But it feels like Kershia does not have Erin's best interests at heart. They end up going into a big conversation about how Erin maybe got to our world via Kershia going what's the thing you actually want? And she offers her a load of things like money and a fertile mate and all this sort of stuff. And Erin's like, no, I don't really need any of that. And she's like, well, what do you really want? And she eventually ends up saying oh, I want to go home. So, yeah, it's a bit sad. But she that kind of brings her down, because she had essentially been just kind of she'd been putting it off and ignoring it and trying not to think about it because she missed everyone at home. I don't actually know how long she's been here now. I want to say months, maybe a small number of months. But definitely more than weeks. I feel like it was weeks before she met anyone. And it's now been a long time since she met anyone. They then talk about how Erin might get home using an archmage, the most powerful wizards in the world. And Kershia is like, well, there are no true archmages anymore, but there's 3 people who call themselves archmages at Wistrom College, which is where Pisces learn to use magic. So she's like, oh, well, maybe you have to go to Wistrom, and then so that whole thing is going on, and then she's like, well, going to Wistrom is probably really hard, and I've never heard of anyone making a spell to go between universes. So she basically makes it seem like it's kind of impossible for Erin to go home. And then she's like, even to get to Wistrom to ask around about it would probably be like way too much money. So I don't know how much trust we can put in Kershia here. And the one other thing I was thinking about as I was reading this was, I wonder if Erin does ever get to go home. She's built friendships and relationships in World now. But the thing that I keep thinking of is like, oh, I think it'd be quite cool actually to have a chapter with like, you know, Erin and Pisces going to Earth, like going to New York or something. But the big thing, I guess, is that there's no reason for Erin to go home. Or to come back to the Wandering Inn. Obviously, that's where the story's set, and she's the protagonist. So it feels unlikely currently that there's any chance of them going back to Earth, because why would you come back to Inworld unless maybe there's some magical curse or something like that? But or maybe Erin might feel responsible for a certain thing. But yeah, there's no like love interest or anything like that maybe that would cause her to be like, well, I have to be in Inworld because I have to be with this person. So yeah, I don't know whether we'll ever get to that point where we get to have in-world characters exploring Earth. But that's something that I really enjoyed in The Dark Tower, is the kind of fantasy characters exploring modern day New York. Well, like 90s New York when it was written, but you know what I mean. And then also, I mean, you look back even at Star Trek IV, The Undiscovered Country. I used to be a big Star Trek head growing up. And like Spock being on 20th century, being in 20th century San Francisco was actually really funny. And I think that Pirate could do something really good there. So this conversation is quite long. But essentially that's how it kind of leads out, is that Erin's like, man, well, it's probably time for me to try and raise some money and go to Wistrom. Kershia walks her to the gate, and Erin meets back up with our skeleton friend, who now has a name. He's called Torin, but which is apparently Dutch for rook. But Kershia only really walks her to the gate for like kind of ulterior motives, in that she talks to the gate guard, who is her nephew, about how he's been watching her, and also the nephew was listening at the window and listening to her talk. So he knows Erin's from another world, although Kershia did say she was going to tell her whole tribe because she was honor bound to do it, basically. So it seems like the Knolls definitely, like I said, do not have Erin's best interests at heart. And I'll be very interested to see where this storyline goes, because it feels like there's a lot of potential for like some big character betrayals. Although I did like Kershia, so you know, I'm not sure. The one thing that the conversation ends where the nephew is like, oh, how do we protect Erin if we can't be near her because she lives in the inn or whatever? And Kershia's like, oh, well, we give her the means to protect herself. So something's going on there. Maybe they will train her to fight. Next, we get Torin, his POV. So he's been waiting outside the town for Erin to come back. And what he did while he was waiting, because she said do something productive, he killed a load of fish. And he's basically been farming XP. He says it says he's feeling stronger and faster and more agile, and he's learned skills. He's been fighting fish and trying to level up. And when he was fighting the fish, he would basically like pummel them into bits and then leave them in the inn. But then what happens then, of course, is that Erin sees the like pummel to bits fish and is like, oh, I can actually see a way to cook that into something using her basic cooking skill. So she couldn't see it before when it was covered in scales or whatever, but now that he's pulverized it, she can see it. So she starts cleaning up the kitchen and preparing to make some food out of the dead fish guts. But then it turns out, well, basically, Erin's like, she's kind of trying to clean it all up, and she's got it into like a nice neat pile, and she's like, oh yeah, I can make something into this. And then she basically like starts punching and kicking the pile of fish guts and covering herself in blood in anger. This scene felt really like visceral and visual. Like I could imagine how this scene looked in my head. I find myself very like drawn emotionally to Erin and what she's going through. I think the Pirates are really good, really good at kind of bringing across Erin's emotional state. So yeah, overall, a great chapter as always, because they're always great chapters. But I feel like we had some great plot progression here. So we obviously have the thing going on with the Knolls. I'm super interested in the skeleton in Torin, because he feels a bit like it's hard to say, like a replacement Klibich, but actually to me, he kind of does. So he fulfills this kind of like kindly best friendy sort of character, who there's something interesting going on with. Because like Celis, I don't feel like there's much interesting going on with her specifically. And Kershia is kind of moving out of the like friend zone and into the like antagonist zone. So Torin has kind of taken the interest spot almost of Kershia. Yeah, good chapter. Let's reconvene next Thursday, when we will discuss chapter 47. Let me check. I think this might be a Ryoka chapter, because that feels like a good ending. Yep, chapter 47 is a Ryoka chapter. So looking forward to reading that one. And if you read this chapter and you have any thoughts on it, please drop down into the comments and we can chat about it. If you like this video, please give it a like, and please do subscribe to the channel, because every little subscription helps. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.